Good evening to all of you. I'm always, evening. Good morning to all of you. See, there's one example. I just wanted to say something. I do a lot of speaking engagements like this, and I get the opportunity to talk to many different cities and countries in South Africa, and there's a different way that they treat the speakers, the audiences in the different cities in South Africa. For example, in Durban, no, I don't like the Durbanites, no really, because there's always a wisecrack somewhere trying to catch you out. Cape Town, so Cape Town, I mean, they sort of sleepy, but they do engage, and they sort of look with bright eyes, these guys coming from Gauteng. Pretoria, they don't say a word. I mean, they just stun. The same with Bloemfontein, they just stun. So Johannesburg is different. You get, people are friendlier, but you have to be very careful. They're quite sharp and clued up on what's going on. So thank you very much, and good morning, not good evening. All right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to chat a little bit about some interesting developments about the way I see it, politics internationally, some changes in terms of what's happening with the world economy, because that is very important for a small open economy like South Africa. And then maybe I try to identify one or two possible dangers internationally, and then go to South Africa, touch a little bit on politics in South Africa, the South African economy, and then I'm going to talk about this very, very exciting new technology called the blockchain. And I think this is going to change the world. All right, let's get going. Now, of course, if you want to talk about what's going on internationally, you can go back, you can literally go millions of years. I've got a talk where I go back 100,000 years, and it's important 100,000 years ago because everything started here in South Africa. There's a cave in the Southern Cape called Blombos, and the first science of abstract thinking really was discovered in Blombos. So in a way, we all sort of started in Southern Africa. This is a good place to be. This is really indeed the cradle of humankind. I'm not going to start that long ago. I'm going to start more recently, only about 100 years or so ago. Now, if you compare the world 100 years ago to what we have today, there are a couple of things that are, and sometimes in economics, things happen so fast you can't see it. Look, for example, at the financial crisis, and sometimes things happen so slow you can't see it. So let's be, what's been happening in the past 100 years? 100 years ago, more than 90% of people lived in abject poverty. It's only 100 years ago. Today, less than 10% of people live in abject poverty. At the current trend, we're probably going to eradicate abject poverty within the next 10 or 20 years or so. And a couple of other things happened the past 100 years ago. One very important thing that happened is, it only recently, less than 100 years ago, where it became compulsory in most countries in the world to send girls to school. Really only relatively recently. And that had a huge impact on social structures and in economies and things like that. And only relatively, just after the Second World War, there was a kind of a new dawn for the world. It was a period when we got rid of the kings and the queens and the sultans and the tsars and so on. And it was the era of human rights and democracy and private property rights. And we decided on a couple of things. We established a couple of institutions. Like, for example, the World Bank and the IMF. We even decided on the world currency. And the world's currency after the Second World War was basically gold. And we had this amazing time the last couple of decades, especially the Chinese. They succeeded in uplifting 600 million people out of poverty. The past, was it 20 years or so? We've never seen so much wealth creation. It's been happening quite slow. But of course, that deal after the Second World War was gradually coming to an end. And we can see it in all sorts of things. The first thing that happened was when we stepped off the gold standard, Richard Nixon actually. Now, if you don't use gold as money, you have to use something else as money, and we started using the dollar. The problem with using somebody else's money, because the dollar is the world's currency mostly, if you use somebody else's money, you pay a tax to them. And that's part of the reason why the US economy is such a huge and successful economy in the world, because we're all paying a tax to the Americans, because we use their currency for international trade and so on. But recently a couple of things started to change as well. Remember, the idea was human rights, democracy and so on, but governments started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and today we have this massive bureaucratic institutions calling themselves governments. And not only are they huge, of course they need a lot of money to keep on going, and that means a lot of taxes. And they are borrowing like there is no tomorrow. The debt levels internationally today are higher than it was just before the financial crisis, 2008, for instance. It just keeps on going up. Not only that, some new institutions that we've created, also relatively new, are central banks. Central banks are not old institutions. The oldest one is the Riksbank in Sweden, but most of them are relatively new creations. But central banks initially was created literally to make money. But recently, they've become responsible for just about everything. Making money, checking inflation, checking money supply aggregates or financial aggregates. They're responsible for financial markets. They're responsible for the banks. They're responsible for employment. They're responsible for economic growth. Just about everything. And they're doing weird things, central banks. Things that we never thought they will ever do. Like, for instance, with the financial crisis, they did two things, giving it fancy names, but they reduced the interest rates to below zero. To below zero. Imagine I'm an asset manager. So I take somebody's money, I take my client's money, and I invest it in a money market, for instance, in an environment of below zero interest rates, and I guarantee my clients I'm going to give them back less. That's what it means, with interest rates below zero. So what do I do as an asset manager? I'm looking for alternatives with higher risks, putting money on things like the equity markets and so on, pushing other financial asset prices up to probably too high levels. So that's creating this sort of, well, let's call it a frothing environment, not necessarily bubbles. But that's what central banks are doing. And they're doing something else as well. They're doing quantitative easing. That's a fancy word for we print money. And that's what they've been doing. Massive amounts of money. In the case of the Federal Reserve, they printed, created out of nothing, more than $4 trillion. I mean, they print money and give it to the government, essentially, give it to the politicians to spend. Bob tried the same in Zim. They didn't work out. But the Americans can do that. The Europeans are doing that. Japanese are doing that. But the other guys can't do it. Now, it seems to me as we probably come to an end of that hugely expansionary monetary policy phase of central banks internationally. The Americans recently started increasing short-term interest rates, and they're doing quantitative tightening, where instead of keep on buying financial instruments and pushing money into this financial system, some of these instruments are expiring now, and they simply start taking some liquidity out of the financial markets. But one of the biggest threats that I'm a little bit concerned about is that, remember, central banks, they are very influential when it comes to short-term interest rates. They set short-term interest rates. In the case of South Africa, we call it the repo rate. So a central bank will set short-term interest rate, and what the Americans have been doing recently, they've been increasing their short-term interest rates. And that's part of the reason why the dollar is strengthening, by the way. At the same time, longer-term interest rates are mostly market-determined by supply and demand forces. That has certainly been going up as well, but at a slower rate. Now, here's a tool that we economists use. I think it's the most amazing thing. I call it that sexy curve, and that is the yield curve. The yield curve is simply a line through different interest rates, short-term, medium-term, and longer-term interest rates. And typically, the longer you put your money at the bank, the better your return, the higher the interest rate you get. And the reason for that is because of risk profiles and so on. But the yield curve is usually an indication of underlying economic activity. Now, what's been happening in America, short rates have been going up, long rates also, but at a slower rate. And this thing, the yield curve, is getting flatter and flatter and flatter. And at the current trend, eventually, longer rates will dip below short-term interest rates. So an inverse yield curve. And that is a sign, usually, of an imminent recession in America. So watch out. Watch out for the American economy. If they keep on increasing interest rates too quickly in the short end now, it might dip the US economy into recession. Of course, that's the biggest economy in the world, and that is certainly going to hurt us. Something else that is happening is that this guy called Trump, okay, he's recently started with this protectionism, trying to protect the US economy, and that's affecting the South African economy as well. They implemented these sort of import duties. We are not allowed to export. You have to pay 25% if you export iron or steel, for example, to the US economy. But in a weird way, it may turn out quite well. Because what has happened, I just read an article, is that the Chinese actually conceded now, and they decided, listen, we're not going to go on with the trade war, and we're trying to, save this trading agreements between the different countries in the world. So it's not necessarily bad, but that is certainly a potential threat to the world if it eventually breaks out in a full-scale trade war. And the small guys, like South Africa, will be affected. And remember, we get preference treatment from the Americans through this special legislation called AGOA, where we are allowed to export to America relatively easily. And if we don't please Trump, he may just decide to stop this AGOA agreement for countries like, for example, South Africa, and that's going to hurt us as well. But politically, what is happening internationally, people are realizing all of this. They realize that we got rid of the the kings and the queens and the tsars and so on after the Second World War. We started this new dawn. But all of a sudden, we've got the new Uber class. And the new Uber class are the career politicians, the career bureaucrats, and the career central bankers. And in a way, there are some fault lines coming to the fore because of this. I think people are trying to get rid of this new Uber class. And I think Brexit is an excellent example of that. People, and we know the Brits, they like to order everybody around, but they do not like to be ordered around. And they said, listen, we don't like the Brussels telling us how to conduct our own policies and so on. They decided to leave the European Union. Another example is what's currently happening in Italy. They are considering even leaving this new funny political parties that they have there. They consider even leaving the Euro area. And what's just happened in Catalonia is another good example, and many other examples. And I would argue, and you can, whatever you want to say about Trump, you simply cannot call him part of the establishment. And that's part of the reason why he was elected in the United States, because people are sick and tired of the establishment. They're sick and tired of these rent seekers, the career politicians and the career bureaucrats. Okay, that's some international, some perspective on how I see the international environment. Coming to South Africa. Now, when you talk about South Africa, when you talk about politics in South Africa, that I get calls from a journalist and so quite a lot, and I tell them, for example, I try to explain to them a couple of things, like for example, what happened to Transnet recently. Some guys was running Transnet, then he resigned, but he didn't really resign. Then he went to Parliament because he's going to become Minister of Finance. Then he didn't, because he actually never led Transnet, and now he should be paid 30 million rand. So I try to explain this sort of stuff to the guy. I mean, they said, huh? You can't believe this. So the only way that you can understand what's going on in South Africa is to understand politics. And the only way you can understand politics is if you've been born here. And even that doesn't always help. So let's see if we can understand a little bit about politics in South Africa. And let's go a bit back in history, perhaps, because all of these different role plays, political role plays, they have different histories and different agendas and different ideologies and so on. So a short history of South African politics. We have today the tripartite lines. Now that was the ANC, a liberation organization initially, and the liberation, then they did quite a good job in being a liberation organization. But the interesting and the funny thing about the ANC in 1994 is that they reinvented themselves and became what I would call a new liberalist kind of political party. And things went, and usually what happens, and there are many examples in Southeast Asia and South America and the rest of Africa, when these liberation organizations, especially the left-leaning type, when they come into government, they implement all sorts of socialist policies and so on, which is quite bad for the economies usually. But not the ANC. They became a new liberalist bunch. They liberalized the markets and all sorts of things, and the markets started doing, and the economy started doing not too badly. But around about 2008, 2009, the beginning of the Z period, they sort of changed track again. And they reinvented their liberation roots again. And the ANC seems to be a liberation organization all over again. You hear things like, for example, expropriation without compensation, national democratic revolution, that sort of stuff. And I don't, not only does it seem to me as if the ANC is sort of changing to its original roots, we've also seen, especially under the Zuma administration, a massive damage to South Africa's institutions. Now it's easy to understand Eskom, for example. Eskom that is financially ruined. I've done some calculation. If it hasn't been for Eskom, if it was just simply properly run, the South African economy would have been at least 10% bigger than what it is today. We're talking about 1 million extra jobs that we could have had if it wasn't for Eskom. That parasitic institution, South African Airways, they're probably going to need another 20-odd billion rand bailout from us, you and me. That will bring it up to about 70 billion, more than 70 billion rand that we will have to fork out. In fact, the problem with SAA is so huge is that you can't just close it down. Just to close it down will probably cost us about 20 billion rand. So that is, and there are many other examples of, but more importantly, the damage caused to those institutions that are supposed to keep the politicians on the straight and narrow is also immense. I'm talking about the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa, especially under Zuma. You know the guy, the sheep guy, that is still there. I'm talking about the Public Protector. The Public Protector was certainly under attack by the previous administration. In fact, government and the parliament was in contempt of court, and many other examples. Also, the South African Reserve Bank was under attack last year. That, fortunately, that was sorted out. So the immense damage caused to the South African economy, and it's probably going to take us many, many years before we get out of this. Probably another 10 years before we can go back to where we were about 10 years ago. That's the ANC. The second role player in a tripartite alliance, and we can see this, what's happening today, yesterday and today, and that's COSATU. So COSATU basically is the marketing arm of the ANC. COSATU used to be the home of the worker, not anymore. COSATU today is the home of the civil servant. So the majority of COSATU members today are civil servants. And they've succeeded in putting huge pressure on the Minister of Finance. They're part of the partnership, the tripartite alliance, putting a lot of pressure on the Minister of Finance to employ even more civil servants. And we have today, depending on your definition, but we have as many as, say, 3 million civil servants working for us. And they are hugely overpaid. They are at least 40% better remunerated than a private sector equivalent. So COSATU is not a home or the house of the workers anymore. It is the house of the civil service. So we have the civil service in government, with government, governing the civil service, which is totally unsustainable. And that contributed to where we are in our fiscal accounts today, and I'll touch about that a little bit later. The third role player, and COSATU, by the way, has just succeeded, it seems, in forcing government to give them another round of excessive wage increases just now. So it's an whole process today. Okay, the third role player is the South African Communist Party. And they are the intelligentsia, in a way. They provide the ideological base for the tripartite alliance. Not to be confused with intelligence, those are two different things. But they are there to tell the tripartite alliance what they stand for. And of course, the South African Communist Party with a beautiful history. And I can go through with some of the history ended up in Braamfontein streets. They marched with them, with the Communist Party of South Africa, it was called then. March, I think it's 1922, with the Mynwerkersunie in the streets of Braamfontein. Go and read that up. That's really interesting. And the Mynwerkersunie today is called, anybody know? Solidariteit or Solidarity. So they were quite close at one stage. Anyway, so the South African Communist Party, remember, like in all ideologies, you have different schools of thought within that ideology. And in communism, there are many different schools of thought as well, but two major ones. The one is Marxism and the other one is Leninism. Now, Karl Marx said that you must give the power to the people. And that's where the word Soviet comes from. Soviet, and I know I'm married to a Russian girl, and they're tough. So the word Soviet means a local authority. And that's where the power should, that's the word Soviet Union. That's where the power must be, with the people. Karl Marx said no, or rather Lenin said no. Vladimir Ilyanov, his original name. Lenin said, no. People are stupid. You cannot give the power to the people. You first have to train them in economics and politics and so on. Then you can give the power back to the people, which of course never happened. So Lenin believes in the centralization of power. And that's what we have. The South African Communist Party, the ideologues, they are a bunch of Leninists believing in a centralization of power. And that's why we've seen, especially the past 10 years, all the it makes sense, because that's part of the ideology of the tripartite alliance. Centralized stuff, cadre deployment, creating this environment of what we call today state capture. That's where it comes from. All right, what's the political consequences of this? And on the fiscal accounts, we can see it quite easily. Now, the fiscal accounts is what the Minister of Finance does, and he takes a lot of our money, and he spends it on all sort of things, and we've seen a huge increase in state spending in the last couple of years. Of course, on bailouts, on all these different state-owned, on these parasitals, for instance, but a huge increase on the salaries and states and civil servants that we've seen the last couple of years, and many. So most of this increases went to people in one way or the other. Some of that went to Dubai, for instance. All right, so a lot of increases in spending are going to people. And at the same time, you need to fund it, getting money from somewhere. And of course, you fund it from two sources. You get money from the taxpayer or you borrow money. And they've been doing both. And the debt levels, because of all this borrowing, is currently at record high levels. Our debt levels today is about 55, state debt levels on a specific definition. And there are many different definitions. I try to follow the Reserve Bank's definition. It's currently around about 55% of GDP, the highest ever. But if you include the guarantees of the state-owned enterprises, it's about 70% of GDP. The fastest growing expense item by the Minister of Finance is interest on state debt. All right, so where's the money? So you borrow a lot of money, or you get it from by way of taxes coming out of your pockets. And we've already seen this budget, the past budget, a number of increases in different taxes, some of them by stealth, Like personal income tax increase, if you don't make adjustments for inflation, it actually results in an increase in personal income taxes. So we've seen an increase in personal income taxes, the fuel levy going up, and by the way, the fuel price is probably going to go up by another 80 cents a litre next month. 80 cents a litre. That's partly because of the high international oil price and a weaker rand as well. Okay, so so I'm afraid to say that. So we've seen a number of new taxes and so on, and the Davis Tax Commission has recommended, amongst others, that we shouldn't have a so-called wealth tax yet, but we should try to get to a wealth tax eventually in South Africa. So expect next year when you complete your tax return form that there will be an additional couple of questions. What do you own? With the idea of building up a database so that we can tax your wealth as well in future. In fact, we have a number of wealth taxes already. In fact, the South African fiscus is the most redistributive fiscus in the world. And because of this debt levels going up and so on, that's one of the main reasons why we've seen a cut in South Africa's ratings. And then, so that's when you talk about the fiscal accounts. Another institution, and this is one that is very well managed in South Africa, and that's the South African Reserve Bank. And I don't always agree with policy, the South African Reserve Bank's policy, but I think they're doing a good job, and they're very much independent. And there was, like I've mentioned, this attack on the South African Reserve Bank last year. So when you talk about the Reserve Bank, you talk about two things. You talk about short-term interest rates, and you talk about the exchange rate of the rand. Those are the two important things. Now, the Reserve Bank recently reduced short-term interest rates, the repo rate, and there certainly was a possibility or a window of opportunity for the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates a little bit more. But with the increases in value-added tax, the increases in the fuel levy, and the weaker currency, and the international oil price and so on, all those sort of things are adding upward pressure on inflation now, and I'm afraid that window of opportunity has closed now. I don't think the Reserve Bank can cut interest rates anymore. But remember, internationally rates are going up, so eventually the Reserve Bank have to follow the international trends. We're not there yet, but there's a possibility maybe the second half, depending what happens, of course, but there's a possibility of a rate increase, not much, by next year or so. But even if there is a rate increase, interest rates in South Africa are relatively low, and I encourage people to consider gearing stuff. So if you want to acquire an income generating asset, for instance, a business, consider borrowing money against that. Because interest rates money is cheap. But of course the sums must add up. Don't go and borrow money to go on holiday. That's certainly not what I'm saying. And also on the currency. I see the currency is on its way to 13 to the US dollar. Now, I've done a lot of work on the exchange rate of the rand, and I can tell you I do not know how to forecast the exchange rate of the currency. And I've tried it many times. The correct level for the rand, theoretically, is better than 7 rand to the US. Okay? Now, it's not there. It's close to 13 to the US. So the rand is hugely undervalued. And there are many reasons for that. One important reason has to do with a risk or a risk premium. And over time, but the rand has always been undervalued. And if you compare over time, then the correct, well, based on historic averages, the correct level for the currency today is around about 12 to the US or so. So where it is at the moment has to do with the US dollar strength that we've seen recently and so on. So I would expect the rand to maybe come back a little bit to 12 or so and maybe go back to 11 even in a very good case scenario, but probably unlikely. Because South Africa's inflation rate is going to accelerate now, already doing that, the inflation differentials, the difference between our inflation rate and that of the Americans is roughly over time about 5% or so, suggesting that the South African rand is likely to continue, on average, to depreciate by about 5% to the US dollar over time. So short term, nobody knows what's going to happen, but medium term, longer term, expect a weaker currency. Then on economic growth, South Africa's economic growth, my expectations for economic growth is slightly better than most, the IMF and the World Bank and the Minister of Finance and so on. I expect about 1.6%, and everybody is saying, hurrah, the economy is growing. Well, I'm afraid that's just not good enough. The population is growing at about 2%. So we need to grow 2% just to stay where we are. We have 9 million people more than 9 million people without jobs and so on. And there are some other technical things like productivity changes and so on. We need to grow this economy at 5%. We're not going to get to 5% if we do not make some significant structural adjustments to the South African economy. And these structural adjustments include things like, for example, changes to labor legislation. Labor relations are toxic in South Africa. We need to fix that. We have to reduce the size of the state. It's just, we have to get rid of the state-owned enterprises that are badly managed and so on and so on. Those are the sort of stuff that we need to grow need to do to grow the economy. But there are a couple of very important pluses in South Africa. One is our bond market, our capital market, is trading at about close to 9%. The American bond market is trading at about 3%. So there's a gap of about 6% between the two. Now what does it mean? It means similar kind of products. We in South Africa have to pay much more if we want to borrow money on that specific product than the Americans. That means if you invest in South Africa, in the bond market at least, you're going to get a substantially better return than investing in America. And that's the whole thing, risk and return. So the returns you're going to get doing business in South Africa is significantly higher than in America, but of course you're taking more risk, and that's the beauty. See this as an opportunity. If you are streetwise, if you understand your business, if you understand the industry in which you are working, and you've been running a business for some time, you understand all these things about running these businesses, then South Africa is the most amazing place to be because of the high risk, implying the high returns. And I get the opportunity to meet many business people in South Africa, and I'm just amazed how successful they are. There are so many successful people. Unfortunately, and I think this is a national disaster, the quality of South Africa's primary education is absolutely horrible. Despite us spending more on education than most countries in the world, the quality is of the lowest, of the weakest in the world. And of course, that means that a large number of our young people in South Africa simply do not have the skills to participate in this new thing called the fourth industrial revolution. Let me just make a comment about, and then I'll get to the fun part, make a comment about some international trends in terms of economies, and also we can see that in South Africa as well. Let's assume we all wash out on an island. What's the first thing we're going to do? Well, we're going to kill stuff and eat it. It's called being a hunter-gatherer society. So that's the first economy, hunter-gatherers. Kill stuff and eat it quickly before somebody else eats it. All right. And then when we start in the modern economies, the first thing that we start doing is from there on, we move on to the next step, and that is to get involved in the primary industries. The primary industries are the dirty industries. So we dig stuff out of the ground, or we start planting stuff and look after animals and so on. That's agriculture and mining are examples of the primary industries. And then from there on, we take whatever we've produced in the primary industries and we add some value to that in the secondary industries. And a very good example is, of course, manufacturing. Okay, you take the wool from the sheep and you knit a jersey. That's the secondary industry. And from there on, you move into the tertiary industries, and a very good example is services. Okay, so you've got the sheep, you slaughter the sheep, and you serve the sheep on a plate somewhere. That's the different industries. But the interesting thing is, what's been happening globally, and in South Africa we can see that as well, as economies evolve and mature, it moves from the primary industries more to the secondary, more to the service industry. And you guys are all mostly in the service industry. And something else that is really interesting about this evolution in technology and economies is that the primary industry quite often is actually moving into the service industry as well. Now let me give you an example. If you look at agriculture, that's a good example. And that's where the politicians are missing out, and quite a lot of people in the agricultural sector also missing out. They don't see this. But if you look at a piece of land 100 years ago, and you look at that same piece of land today, it's the same piece of land, yet the production increased multiple times on that same piece of land. Why is that? Where did the value add come from? And the value add came from a couple of places. Firstly, skills, very special skills to know what to do with this land. But also very importantly, a lot of this value add did not happen on the land. It happened in a lab. Like genetic engineering, for example. Like an engineer building a drone for knowing exactly what to spray wherever on the lands and so on. That's where the value add is happening. And agriculture in future, and it's already there, is going to become more of a service industry. So not only are things moving into the service industry more and more, very importantly, and this is important to understand, that the service industry can be digitized. Now, many examples. if you download, if you read news on your phone, that's an example of digital information reaching you from the service industry. If you send an email between individuals, that's an information of digital information in the service industry. If you download software, if you get information about the genome of a new animal, for example, and they email it to you, that's examples of the service industry. Now, I'm going to come back to this a little bit when I talk about the blockchain and the Bitcoin just now. So remember, the world is moving more into the service industry, and the service industry can be digitized. All right, that's where we are, the world, and that's where we are in South Africa. There are a couple of other positives. The fact that we're part of Africa is certainly a positive. The fact that we're part of BRICS is certainly a positive. We have to be very careful. Don't make the guy with the orange hair too angry. So don't make sure that we keep doing business with as many countries in the world as possible. But those are sort of pluses for being in South Africa. And there are many other things also. South Africa's financial markets are exceptionally well regulated, very, very liquid, and very much integrated with the rest of the world. And all that, of course, is digital, and it's part of the service industry. And that's the industry that's been growing very nicely. And you guys are mostly working in that kind of industry as well. Okay, now I want to talk about the blockchain. I don't have that much time. And I want to explain this thing about blockchain and how that's going to impact our world and so on. So I need to ask just a question. Is there anybody here that understands the blockchain? Let me just check. Okay, is there anybody here that knows nothing about the blockchain? Okay, there's one, two, a couple. Okay, that seems to be the majority. Other guys, they're sort of in between. So they know a little bit about the blockchain. Now, I'm going to explain the blockchain to you this morning. And I'm going to explain it in a way that I promise you will understand the blockchain when you walk out here. In fact, you will understand it so well, you will be able to explain it to your kids or your grandkids, which probably never's got here. Oh, well, I know one or two guys with grandkids. All right. So it's easy, but you have to, come and work with me. And I need you to do two things for me. Don't think out of the box. Get rid of the box. That's very important. Usually, when you're confronted with a new idea, you try to hook it into something that you understand. Don't do it. Okay, just open your mind. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's going to sound very simple. And people tend to, when something sounds complicated, if they hear, but this is really easy, then they try to make it more complicated for themselves. Because things are not easy. Things must be complicated. Well, this is easy. Please, if it sounds too easy, it is because it is that easy. Now, I'm going to explain the blockchain. There are a couple of requirements to start a blockchain. And let's start a blockchain here this morning. I'm going to start a blockchain. And all of us, we're going to start. The first requirement is that you need a network of some sorts. Now, this is excellent. This is a network. We're going to look at we're going to network a little bit later. So this is a group of people. This is what we need. You need a network of some sort. And this is what we have here, firstly. Secondly, we agree, all of us, that from now on, we do not have any secrets anymore. And everybody knows everything about everybody else. Okay. For example, you all know that this is my cell phone. So what do you know about this cell phone? You know that the ownership, or the owner, the information ownership is that Dawie is the owner of this cell phone. Now something, I just said something very important. The information, namely ownership, is that Dawie is the owner of this cell phone. And we all share this information. Now, I take my cell phone and I give it to this gentleman here. Now, what happens? You are all witnessing this action, this transaction, and the information, namely, Dawie is the owner, changes to this gentleman is the owner. So ownership information, and you're all witnessing this, moves from me to him. And you're all witnessing it. Also important, tomorrow morning, I want to give my cell phone to the professor. You're all going to say, but I cannot do that because I am not the owner anymore. He is the owner. That's the blockchain. And that really is the blockchain. We share information, and because we're all sharing this information, and because no single person is in charge of this network, the system is quite stable, and because we're all sharing this information, we can all actually trust this information because everybody else checks or polices everybody else. And the only way that I can hack this blockchain is if I somehow take control of more than you guys, more than half of you guys, and I put you in a little corner outside and say, listen, let's change this information that I'm actually still the owner of the cell phone, which is not going to happen because it's not practically possible. So we simply share information. Please, that is the essence of the blockchain. It's information flowing on a network. Right. But of course, it's a little bit more complicated. But I understand that. So now let's just add one or two things. One is, of course, it's not people sharing information. It's a network of computers. So a network of computers share information. And I'm not going to get too technical, but you can also not see who's sitting behind the computer because there's not a face, but there's a number. So what do? We belong to a network where information flows, and because everybody checks everybody else, it's quite stable, and you can actually trust this information, but you can't necessarily see who is behind that computer. And in many instances, this information can be encrypted. All right. So we get that situation where everybody checks everybody else, but you don't know who the individual behind the information necessarily is. Okay, I just had to add that, but it's not really important. The important part really, it's information that flows over a network. Right, now we understand the blockchain. Now I must explain something else, and that's a little bit about money. What is money? Money, and the definition for money is anything that is generally accepted as money is money. Anything. And there are many examples of these sort of things. We use shells, we use cattle, we use pieces of metal, we squeeze them down, a little round discs, we call it coins. Eventually we started using notes as money. Some guys made new monies, or some guys destroyed their monies, like the Zimbabweans recently, or the Europeans, and they decided to make a new money called the euro, for example. So monies come and go, and the forms of money come and go. But today, money is usually in the form of zeros and ones on computers. It's just information on computers. So if you make a transfer from your bank account to somebody else's bank account, there's no bank manager running with a suitcase of money to another bank. It's just information. It's digital. And the Reserve Bank checks all of this because the Reserve Bank, unlike a blockchain, the Reserve Bank is the central authority. And they run this whole thing, this information network that they are in charge of. So money is anything that is generally accepted as money. Now let's assume this morning that we are going to create our own money. And we call it a coin. Or let's call it a credit. And we all decide on our network here that we all will have one credit from tomorrow morning. And that's what we decide to do. Because anything that is generally accepted as money is money. And tomorrow morning, we all look on our apps on our cell phones, and there's one credit, and we all only have one credit. So I can take my credit, and I go to the dear professor, and I can transfer from my app to him, and you are all witnessing this, my credit, and I can take his cell phone. Now he's got 2 credits, and I have 2 cell phones. That's what Bitcoin is. It's just information about something that is generally accepted as money. Now you understand Bitcoin. And any network can come together and they can decide to make their own money if they want to. In fact, it happens every day. In fact, you will party to some of these networks that created money. If you go to a school fair, you buy these little pink slips to buy your Coke and your hamburger and your pannekoek inside, the school fair, for instance. That little slip, pink slip, is money. This is just a digital form on cell phones. Now you understand Bitcoin as well. Right. But, so what's this? Why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. One, is it possible for me to make a transfer from my government money account, rands. Rands in South Africa is government money or central bank money or centralized money. Is it possible for me to make a transfer from my bank account into your bank account directly? And the answer is no. Because what I will do, I will tell my bank to transfer money to your bank and your bank to make a deposit into your bank account. Everything is, of course, digital. So it is impossible to use government money or central bank money without making use of a financial intermediary. There's one exception, and that's with cash. You can use cash to buy directly to somebody. You can give somebody cash and he will give you some omkyk twak or illegal stuff and so on. So people use cash. People use cash if they want to evade taxes because you cannot trace this sort of stuff. So cash is an exception. But when you use digital government money, you can always be traced and you will always make use of a financial intermediary. With private, digital, and especially encrypted money, I transfer money from my cell phone to somebody else's cell phone without making use of a financial intermediary. Now here is a prediction. I predict we're going to see a dramatic change in the way we do finance, business, especially banking. And it's even possible that banks may disappear in the form that we understand banking today. Because why will I make use of a bank if I can simply transfer money like cash between individuals in a secure manner? And if banks change, and they will change, it's happening already. In fact, some of the big international banks are already making use of the blockchain. In fact, the Rijksbank, the oldest central bank in the world, is considering issuing their own cryptocurrency, which will mean if the South African Reserve Bank decides to issue their own cryptocurrency, we will all, in a way, have bank accounts with the South African Reserve Bank directly. So there are massive changes as far as the way we use money that is on its way. Secondly, so the Minister of Finance realizes all of a sudden now that people are not making use of the bank accounts anymore. It's very difficult to trace transactions. You can't go to a bank and say, listen, the banks are, by the way, are forced by legislation to reveal or to report certain big deposits in the banks. You all know this, FICA and that sort of nonsense. All right. What's going to happen now? The Minister of Finance realized, but all of a sudden, the people are not making use of banks anymore because we've decided to use something else as money. Our own credit or Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever the case might be. So there are less transactions going through the financial system. And 95% of all taxes are financial transaction taxes. So the Minister of Finance is going to walk in here and say, hey, listen, you guys, I know you guys been doing business amongst each other. I want my share. How much money do you have? How many coins do you have in your cell phone? What am I going to tell the Minister of Finance? I've forgotten my password. It's encrypted. He can't see it. So I make another prediction. What we're probably going to see, because of this technology, is there's going to be a dramatic change in the way that they're going to tax us in future. And things that are going to be taxed will be physical stuff, property, cars and things, and heads, toll roads, poll taxes, those sort of stuff that they can tax us. But financial transaction taxes are going to be dramatically more difficult. But of course, there's a lot of dangers in this. Now I can send money to a terrorist organization. I can buy illegal stuff much easier. And that is in fact what is happening. But I prefer a world with more danger and more freedom than a world of less danger and less freedom. And it doesn't have to end with money. In fact, it means so much more. You can actually put ownership on a blockchain. And in future, you're going to buy a house. And it's literally going to take you seconds. The whole process of transfer a house. Now you need a transfer lawyer, you need the bureaucrats in Pretoria you need a lot of stuff and guarantees from banks. You're not going to use that in future. You're simply going to do it on the blockchain, literally in seconds. In the future, we all agree, if somebody steals my car, you will all give me 1 coin. And if I report you, my car has been stolen, you all give me 1 coin. Without a financial intermediary, it's going to change insurance dramatically as well. Maybe just a very important comment. Please, and many other examples, please, Bitcoin is not an investment. It is not an investment. But what I certainly advise you to do, download the apps, buy 100 rands worth of any one of these. There are many thousands of them out there. And play with it. Be careful. Don't go and give away your personal information and your password and things like that. Play with that to get used to the technology. This technology is going to change the world. And in fact, it is already changing the world. In fact, we are in a process, what we have done in my company, I've created an underlying financial instrument. We call it a note. It's listed on the JSE in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. We're going to create a coin out of nothing. And I sell you a coin. I give you a coin, you get the coin from me, and I take you 110 rand and I buy the underlying listed entity on the JSE. Now you can sell the coin to anybody else on this network and nobody will see it. And you, being a law-abiding citizen, whenever you make a capital gain, for example, you will report it to SARS and pay capital gains tax because he won't be able to see it. And then one day somebody will bring the coin back to me, and I sell the underlying financial asset, and I give you the whatever it's worth at that stage. Just imagine the possibilities and things that can happen with this. In fact, I think it can go even further. We all belong to WhatsApp groups. We belong to Facebook groups. Why can't Microsoft, as a company, for instance, also send somebody to their own team to the Olympics? And I've got a suspicion this technology will allow us in future to decide what group we want to join. I want to be a member of the Flat Earth Society. And I can do that. And we can. And you can live in South Africa, but you can live wherever you want to in the rest of the world. Because technology will make it possible. And technology will eventually lead to the power that's currently in the hands of the politicians and the technocrats and the central bankers. That power is going to move where it's supposed to be. And that's in the hands of the individual. Thank you very much for listening to me.